China ends its controversial one-child policy, considered the largest population control experiment in history. What effect has it had on the world's most populous nation? And which other countries will have to face up to population crises of their own? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. When Chinese leaders first introduced the one-child policy in 1979, the population of China was rapidly approaching 1 billion. The communist government in Beijing decided, some say misguidedly, that something had to be done to keep the population boom in check. Now, China is facing a different crisis, a rapidly ageing population that'll increase pressure on state pensions and could lead to labour shortages. That's why the Chinese government has decided to abandon its controversial one-child policy, allowing couples to have 2 children instead. However, China will feel the effects of the one-child policy for decades to come. It's estimated to have prevented the births of 400 million children and cut China's fertility rate to somewhere between 1.4 and 1.7 children per woman, far lower than the United States, for example. And because parents have a preference for boys, China now has one of the biggest gender imbalances in the world. So lots to discuss on today's Inside Story. Let's bring in our guests in Nottingham. Andreas Fulda, lecturer at the School of Contemporary Chinese Studies at the University of Nottingham. In Stockholm, via Skype, Hans Rosling, Professor of Global Health at the Karolinska Institute. And in London, Simon Ross, Chief Executive of Population Matters. Good to have all three of you on board. Let me come to you first, Andreas Fulda. Knowing the Chinese the way you do, what's your response to this?
Well, first of all, any kind of policy change in China that is going to meet human needs is to be welcomed. And so overall, I think the echo has been positive. But as ever so often in the case of China, the devil is in the detail, and it will really depend how these policies will be implemented. And there is clearly a policy to practice gap that we've observed time and time again, which is why I think we shouldn't get too carried away just by hearing these announcements.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, because what we know at this stage is that something like 90 million families may qualify for the new 2-child policy. Any idea what those qualifications are?
In previous years, there has been a relaxation of these policies. So, for example, if both parents were single children, they would qualify to have a second child. Or let's say if they were a minority, they belong to a minority, that they would be exempt from the so-called one-child policy. And also in rural parts of China, there would be case-by-case exemptions. But what we've seen is that it hasn't really made a huge difference. And bear in mind that there might be families who want to have more than 2 children. So in essence, what we will get is the one-child policy 2.0, quite literally. What do you do if you want to have 3 children, like Zhang Yimou? He had a 3rd child with his wife Chen Ting, and he was levied a whopping fine of 7 million RMB, which is roughly 700,000 pounds.
Wow,
so
that
this
is
could
a lot
still
of money.
happen
You're right. So we don't know
future.
at this stage how many children you can have. Simon Ross, what is your response to this move?
I'm glad they're relaxing the coercive, draconian nature of this. It is, abuse of human rights, and there is an issue, I think, in all societies of ageing and an imbalance between the young and the old. But China's got its economic and resource problems. We know about the pollution there. We know about how them having to suck in resources from many other countries. So I do hope they keep on trying to lower a population. 1 billion Chinese is still very much. And we've got these problems around the world around sustainability and the environment.
Hans Rosling, what about you?
Well, I think it's long overdue, because these were coercive measures, that interfered in a way which is not acceptable. And it's not needed any longer, because the number of children per woman is low in countries that are similar to China and don't have this policy. Very few people are aware that Taiwan, for instance, they have almost 1 child per woman, whereas in China it is, as you said, 1.5. This means that this policy set by the politicians were not implemented in the bedrooms. And Thailand, I look at Thailand, Thailand has the same amount of children per woman as China have now, but they have reached to there by good access to contraceptives, which is absolutely essential, and also good child survival.
So are you saying that if China hadn't interfered, getting to this point was inevitable anyway? Naturally.
No, I agree with the estimate that some 100 million less population in China now. It's very difficult to determine how many. But the crucial thing China did was not this policy. It was that they provided early education for all girls, basic health service for the whole population, access to contraceptives for all women, and also, don't forget that, access to legal and safe abortion. That is what they did. On top of that, they put the policy. The main effect was not the policy, it was the provision of these essential services.
You all touched on how controversial this policy has been. Andreas, talk us through what was done in the name of this policy. I mean, there's some horrific stories, aren't there?
Yes, indeed. I think one of the problems with the implementation of the so-called one-child policy, actually it's a number of different regulations on the provincial and local level. It could mean for women that they literally had no control over their fertility, and we know of stories of forced abortions, forced sterilization, and all of which can be considered human rights violations. So in a sense, and this is widely being discussed in the Chinese society, it's been a very draconian policy, but there has also been some popular support for it because population growth was enormous in the 1960s and 70s, so it's not entirely without its support. And my concern really is that now that the government is deciding to lift the policy, it might actually a little bit late for quite a few women which are now in their childbearing age or just passing that. And also you shouldn't underestimate that a lot of people have internalized the values behind this policy. So, for example, when Vietnam relaxed its family planning rules, we didn't see so much of a rise of fertility since many women had kind of grown accustomed to having, if at all, just one child. And so to expect now a lot of Chinese women to decide to have a second child, I don't see that happening, because you still have all the concerns that we have in the UK as well, in terms of the cost of raising a child, whether it's early childhood education or tuition fees, etc. So again, it's a welcome step, but I wouldn't be overly optimistic in terms of the potential impacts of that policy change.
Okay, well, I mean, interesting you say that, because the policy change has elicited mixed reactions across China. Let's take a listen.
Because considering my work is really hectic and my child is still little, we were never planning to have a second baby. So this new two-child policy for me doesn't have that big an impact.
I think people decide how many children to raise according to their ability. If they have the ability to take care of more children, then they should be able to have more.
We haven't paid off our mortgage. The other thing is that the expense of raising one child is already really high, so we're worried about how to bring up a second child.
So, Simon, as Andreas was saying, in countries like Vietnam, there wasn't much enthusiasm to increase the numbers when they were encouraged to do so. What do you think the problems are now for China? What would be holding people back in going for 2 children?
I think, a lot of people in Western countries too only have 1 child or no child. There are matters like more leisure interests now than there used to be. There is competition for jobs and interest in your own job. Or perhaps there's a feeling that really if you could focus all your love and attention on that 1 child, that child will do better in a very competitive education system. I don't know that we should be pushing people to have more children in a world where world population is growing very quickly and we have climate change. I do think there's an issue around how we help older people to work later, and I think that's something we need to look at. But not see more people as a solution. I think more people is actually a problem.
Okay, Simon, let's talk a little bit more about the economic impact. I know that shares in condom companies took a bit of a droop today on the markets, but that companies that make diapers, baby strollers and infant formula got a boost. What do you think the overall economic impact will be if we see a growing, younger population?
Well, I think there will certainly be that rising demand for all sorts of child-oriented products, particularly as they go older and they go through the teenage years and so on. So there is that boost. And then when they come into the workforce, of course, you've got more young workers. So you have got that short-term economic boost in terms of more people. But then, of course, in time, they'll go old in their turn. So you do want a balance of ages through the life cycle if you can. But the idea that a big stimulus is good in the short term, but it may bring problems later on.
Hans, do you think the policy changes come too late and that it'll have very little desired effect?
No, the policy is overrun by reality. But I want to make one important comment about the low fertility rate in Asia. It's not about money only. Look at Japan and Singapore. They have all the money, the same as UK and Sweden, but they have 1.4 or 1.1 children per woman. It's about gender equity. In modern Asia today, women, professional women, should take care of their job, of their husband and children, and their parents-in-law, their in-laws. If you get gender equity coming to Asia also, then the number of children will balance up a little closer to 2. Look at Sweden. We have 2.0 children per woman. Germany have 1.5. There's no difference in economy. It's a difference in gender equity.
Okay, let's talk more about the numbers that are around at the moment. It took tens of thousands of years of human history to reach a population of 1 billion people. Now, that happened in 1804, but in just the last 200 years, the world's population has increased sevenfold. In fact, since we started this program, there are almost 1,500 more people in the world. So where are we headed at this rate? Now, this graph shows the world's total population with a prediction that we'll be close to 10 billion people by 2050, with the rate of growth starting to level off after that. Now look at this. This is population growth for young people up to the age of 24. It's already started to level off and will barely increase over the next century. That's in contrast to over 65-year-olds. Predictions show a massive increase in the size of the older population, something which is worrying many countries worldwide. Hans, I know that you've got quite a bit to say about this. Is it a worry?
Yes, I can show you why this will happen. I'm in the studio of Gapminder Foundation. Let me show you here.
Okay.
Each block here represents 1 billion people. There are 2 billion children below the age 15 presently in the world. And there is about 2 billion between 15 and 30. Then 30 to 45, 1 billion, 45 to 60, 1 billion. And then my group, 60 years and older, we are up here. So this is more or less the world population today. The number of children have stopped increasing. It's increasing in Africa, but decreasing in Asia. Now I will show you what will happen. The world population will grow by a new mechanism now. In the next 15 years, the old people will die. The rest, they will grow older and there will be the same amount of children. Then the old will die. The rest will grow older and they will have the same amount of children. And then the old die and the rest, they will grow older and have the same amount of children. So in about 45 years' time, we will have 3 billion people more just by a sort of inevitable fill-up of adults. Of course, the number of children increase in Africa, but decrease in the same rate in Asia. Perhaps we will also have longer life, which will add about 1 billion up here. So we will have about 10 to 11 billion people in the world. And this is assuming that fertility rates will continue to fall rapidly in Africa. But of course, then, women in Africa must have access to contraceptives.
Okay, Andreas and Simon, I wish you could have seen that. It's quite a brilliant visual display of the population, where it stands at the moment. Andreas, but listening to what Hans said, do you agree with that?
I think there is a concern in China that China is going to grow old before it grows rich. And in a sense, dealing with China's aging population will be a massive problem, not just in terms of the demography, but also in terms of the social services, like think of pensions, for example. So in order to build up a functioning pension system, the Chinese party state would need to make much bigger investments in social policy to ensure the well-being of the aging society. What we're seeing right now is actually quite interesting. We're seeing the revival of Confucianism, a kind of very top-down invocation of Confucian ideals that children are supposed to look after their parents. There's even some popular support for that. So, for example, a company has been asking their young employers to pay some of their salary into a fund to support their parents. And so that's a very interesting kind of reaction to that very problem. But I doubt that
because
without
in China, what we're looking at the moment is that you've got more children who'll be looking after more aging people, and at the same time being encouraged to have another child. So the economic impact on them is large.
Yeah, it's not just that. Bear in mind, this policy might not actually materialize the way it's designed. And one of the reasons for that is that we see quite some continuity in terms of the political institutions. So, for example, for provincial and local governments in China, family planning is actually lucrative business. I mentioned the fines earlier that are being levied for people who are in breach of family planning regulations. In 2012, local governments raised an amazing 20 billion RMB. That's 2 billion British pounds. And you can imagine that this is quite a significant source of revenue, which supports a lot of departments on the local level and a lot of jobs in these family planning divisions. And so to assume that just with a stroke from the policymakers from the top, that this kind of bureaucracy is going to disappear, I think is quite unlikely. So my concern is actually that we will see more of the same, and the primary reason being that this kind of new desirable regulatory policy is not being accompanied with political structural reform and the doing away of this bureaucracy, which is, frankly speaking, quite self-serving.
Okay, so obviously a lot needs to be done to address the situation in China and around the world, Simon. I know you're very concerned about the growing population, not only the impact that an aging population will have on services, but if you look at the environment, climate change.
I think that's right. In the developed countries, population growth is slower, but even still in the United States or in the UK, there is still population growth. And then when we look at Africa, as Hans said, there's this big bulge of young people. And even if they have fewer children each, because of people, they're living longer, you will have this very large number of young people who are all looking for jobs and who are increasingly in middle-income countries industrializing and so on. So there's a real threat to wildlife biodiversity for sure in much of the world. And as I say, climate change is coming on us as consumption grows, as urbanization grows, and as the number of people grow. And that will have a feedback effect on wildlife and on agriculture. So even will there be enough food for 10 billion people in 2050 or 11 billion people in 2100 is a real concern with all these pressures on it. I mean, we saw the wars in Syria and Iraq right now. But if you look back at the factors behind that, one of it is those very rapid population growth levels in quite dry countries. So I think there's a number of
So
concerns.
you'll see a different type of migration then, won't you? The sort of environmental migration, if I can put it like that.
That's right. We all remember the famines in the Horn of Africa in the 1980s. But now the populations of those countries, Eritrea, Ethiopia and so on, have grown twofold or threefold. So if they have another drought, the issues will be so much greater. And right across that belt south of the Sahara, there's very high growth rates in population, very dry countryside, and quite limited resources. So absolutely, I think we need to keep a close look on that.
So, Hans, what would you suggest as a solution to this? I mean, you don't see it as a bigger problem as the other two guests, I suspect. But other than birth control, what else needs to be done?
I don't see population growth in Africa as a problem. I see the reason for the population growth as a problem. I go one step deeper in my analysis.
Okay.
We have to end extreme poverty. We have to reduce child mortality. We have to get all girls into school. And then they will ask for contraceptives and should get it. And then we will see the same thing happening in Africa. When it comes to climate change, I don't agree with the analysis. I go deeper. The increase in carbon dioxide emission will be made by middle-income countries, especially upper middle-income countries, and they have very low fertility rates. It's when people have very few children, they can afford to grow their economy and they will emit much more. We can destroy the environment and the climate with 6 billion people, but we have to avoid doing it with 10. That is the challenge in the future. It's a little risky to point at Africa when it's climate change, when the problem is in the other end. It's the richest countries and those becoming rich now. That's where the problem is. But I agree that all women in Africa should have contraceptives as soon as possible, but they won't ask for it until they are out of extreme poverty and until they see their children survive.
Andreas, what do you make of that? And is there a country, a region that you feel is doing it right?
Well, certainly there are Chinese communities at the periphery of mainland China, namely Hong Kong and Taiwan, where we do see a different picture. And both Hong Kong and Taiwan boast excellent health services, good welfare systems, and they could actually, be looked into in closer detail to see, alternative solutions to this problem. Let me just say one thing, because we talked about migration and climate change. In the case of China, we actually have a very interesting phenomenon that is internal migration, and it involves an incredible number of more than 260 million people, many of which are women. And the interesting thing is about this new policy, it doesn't really address the needs of these female migrant workers that are often living in the Chinese metropolitan cities, who have children that are not properly registered under the hukou system, the household registration system, which means that these children do not actually enjoy the same access to social services as, for example, their urbanite counterparts. And I do think that these would be some of the areas that the Chinese party state, the Chinese government should pay more attention to, because there are some real pressing needs for these female migrant workers and their children who actually suffer as a consequence, not so much as now of family planning, but of another regulatory policy, which is the hukou system, which also deserves to be talked about in this context.
So lots to see, but let's wrap up this program with those comments. Andreas Fulda, thank you very much. Also, thank you to Hans Rosling and Simon Ross. And thank you very much for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the program's page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can also post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story or at Jane Dutton. And thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show.